Well, afternoon, everybody. We are doing a training today on interviewing skills. This is sort of an offshoot. Some of you were here when we talked about the recruitment and hiring process. So sort of once you get your recruitment strategy done, interviewing is the next step. So, we talked about selection, hiring best practices, and just to kind of frame up what would have taken place prior to the interviews. You've kind of identified your goals and objectives in your recruitment, what you're looking for, sort of what your philosophy is. You've also, and not so much for parks, on the recreation side, a little bit more maybe for Mike on the park side. Is this a union recruitment, a non-union recruitment? Is it civil service? Is it not civil service? What sort of processes do we have to follow? And then you've talked about on your team and before you placed your ad, sort of what's the target candidate I'm looking for? You've looked at your resumes. You're kind of starting to narrow the pool. And when we talk about narrowing the pool, there's lots of ways to do it. Everybody has a little bit different system. You can go through your resumes and have a very formal ranking system. You can go through them and have yes, maybe, not now. Sometimes we do 1, 2s, and 3s, and then we kind of put it in a spreadsheet and say, three 1s make an interview, 2 2s make an interview, whatever your system is. But today we're really going to talk about what are we doing. We have our candidates now that we want to talk to and begin the interview process. And so the first thing is who's going to interview and what's our interview panel going to look like?
So when you're trying to choose the interview panel that are going to interview your candidates, you want to look at the skill sets that you have within your department and within the people that you'd like to be involved in the interview panel. For an example, you may not want to have the secretary in your office be the person that interviews them, but you want them involved in the process somehow. So they could be your introductory person, they could walk them around, greet them, but they're also watching the candidate for skill sets. Did they greet the secretary? Were they smiling? Did they interact with them, or did they just ignore them and treat them just like a secretary? You want to look at those kind of things as the person walks in. So your secretary or your person who greets the person could be kind of doing that overview, and that is part of the interview panel, even though they may not actually sit on the interview panel. You also want to look at skill sets within your department. Usually there's someone that will be the lead person in the panel, will ask the questions or greet the person, start the interview process off. Sometimes you'll have that person, you could have someone from HR, and we're always glad to help with that. It may just be internally within your department. Choose your lead person, and then also look at the other people on your panel. Is one person going to be the observer, just to kind of watch and see what's happening? Not necessarily involved in asking the questions, but watching the person's eye movement, how they react, are they nervous, looking at all the peripherals and seeing how the person reacts to the questions. Sometimes you want the person to be the heavy. You're asking some very questions about their skill sets, and they're not coming up with the information, or they seem to be evasive. You want someone in that process who can kind of be the heavy, and now you need to tell me these things, and kind of be the sterner person and not necessarily the friendly person in the interview. But mostly you do want to make sure the person feels comfortable and welcome. Not only in the interview process are we trying to find out about the candidate, we're also trying to sell the city. This is this person's maybe first interaction with the city. We want to make sure they have a good experience. So it's not about scaring the candidate. You want to find out the information about them, but trying to make them feel welcome and comfortable through the process, because interviewing is very scary. And the more you can make them feel comfortable, the better they're going to feel about the city. So you want to choose people within your panel who are going to serve all those roles. Oftentimes I will do all the questions. Sometimes people within the panel, you want to switch questions. We just rotate back and forth. It really just depends on the role that you choose for each person in your interview panel.
And the level of position, but is the actual decider on the recruitment going to be on the interview panel? And I'll kind of give you an example. When we promoted Lori to HR technician in our department, we had to backfill Lori's secretarial position. and it just happened to be kind of bad timing. I was going on vacation for 10 days. So I had to decide, as the sort of ultimate decider of the candidate, are we going to wait 10 days to start the interviews while I'm gone, or are we going to move ahead? And so, unfortunately, kind of for Tom and Cindy, they did the initial interviews. I think they interviewed about 20 people and narrowed it down for me to about 5 or 6. And then when I got back, we did the second round of panel interviews. Not every decider is going to be crazy about that. I think it kind of depends. When we were recruiting Cindy after Karen left, Tom and I were in all those interviews. But that's something to think about too. A lot of it depends on how many people you're going to interview that first round, how you're going to narrow your field. You might not be able to get your decider in all the interviews. The other thing I always say is one of my favorite roles is to play the observer. I like these guys when we're in interviews, especially in our department, to ask all the questions, and I kind of sit there and watch the interaction of the candidate. What are the nonverbals? And Tom and Cindy can have very unique styles. Those of you who have interviewed with Tom, Tom's really good at exploring some of the more sort of awkward situations where you have to really drill down into somebody's background. And Tom has a really good sort of a roll up in the way he goes through that. And then talking about things that, have you ever been terminated from a job? Walk us through that process. And if there are areas that you're concerned about with a particular candidate and you want to explore, it's really good to kind of, hey, do I want to do that? Do I want to kind of tap into somebody like Tom who's got great skills and resources to do that?
The other thing you might want to look at is the volume of resumes or applications that you have. If we have a large pool of candidates, we may do a 20-minute meet and greet interview just to weed out the candidates whose resumes look good, instead of spending an hour with each candidate when that candidate probably in the first 5 minutes if they're going to be the right person or not. We may do the 20-minute quick interviews just to get through and see who has good interpersonal skills, looks like they'll be a good fit, and also the good skill sets. Then we'll take those key candidates and move them forward to a longer, more in-depth interview where we may have the department director or someone who has more of a decision-making authority in the process. So those are things to think about too. Instead of doing an hour interview with each candidate, you could make it a little bit shorter in the beginning and spend more time with the quality candidates later.
Yeah, and I think when you have a lot of resumes, it's difficult. If you have a lot of good people, sometimes while it's painful, if you can do the 20 interviews, 20 minutes apiece. We've done that before. When we did the recruitment for the assistant law director position, we had such interest in such great candidates that we wanted to take a look at a pretty large pool of people, and we interviewed I think 25 people, which was it takes a lot of time, but in the end we were really glad that we did it because it really got us people that I think had we been more narrow to begin with, we might not have picked up. And that's another thing too. It's like you're like, 25 interviews, but if you only started with 6 interviews and then you don't find anybody in that 6, then you've got to go back. And so sometimes we're like, think about that. It might be worth it to just do the 20, 25 interviews up front very quickly and then narrow so you don't have to go back into the pool of candidates. The next area that we wanted to touch on is kind of what we call the off-limit areas that we're not allowed to ask questions about. And then how you can elicit information you might be looking for, but do it in a legal manner. And I think Cindy went ahead and passed out the EEO guideline sheet for you guys.
Looks like this.
Yeah, that one. So you should all have that in front of you. So we're going to let Tom kind of touch base on areas that you want to avoid during the interview process.
First of all, when we get to interviewing or we get to selecting candidates, it's about risk management. Risk management, you can't, if you try to eliminate risk, you don't get anything done. It's about trying to manage the risk. And the risk exposures are under federal law and state law, and then by sometimes through your own policies, procedures, and internal rules and regulations, you set a framework that says things you can do and can't do when you're considering candidates. Think of it as a hot stove principle. Don't try to see how close you can get without getting burnt, but stay away from it. But that being said, when we've many times when we've been involved with interviews with you all and we've given you these guidelines, our goal isn't to scare you into thinking, well, geez, I can't do this, I can't do that. The goal is to make it such that by being informed, you know what things you can ask and what things you can probe. So let's go through a couple of them. There are laws against making inquiries about one's age. As a general rule of thumb, you've not violated the law if you've asked about one's youthfulness. For example, in many positions, we need to know that somebody is at least 18 years of age for child labor laws to make sure they can do the job. But when you get candidates who are over 40 and above, there's certain protections that protect them against age discrimination. So questions about age should be avoided. And at any time that any of you would have a question about any of this, go most certainly ask, and I'll do my best. Arrest record. Nowadays, the laws are getting more strict in the area of making inquiries about arrest records. It used to be that you could just about ask anything, then it was it a felony? And now a lot of the inquiries are, has the person a violation in an area that might be significant to the job? I think that right now in the HR world, at least, there's a lot of discussion on that as, for example, I, for one, think that good character is an essential function of the job. So if somebody has characteristics that depart from good character, that, I think, would be important as to the hiring decision. But asking people about, have you ever been stopped by the police, is different than asking them about, have they ever been convicted of a crime that might be related. In many of our crimes, or the crimes that people have, people operate motor vehicles, so we frequently make inquiries about their driving record, because to be a City of Kettering employee that might be using one of our vehicles, that's an important factor. So in arrest record areas, you need to be a little bit careful about your inquiries there. Bankruptcy and credit affairs, there's the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is a law that restricts, basically it says you can make those kind of inquiries. It needs to be job related, but if you do, you have to make candidates aware that if for any reason those decisions were used to deselect them in the process, and if you've received the information from an outside source, you must declare to them what that source was and what the area was. Disability. Disability inquiries, basically anything that's medical or fitness related that might be a disabling condition or whatever, you really pretty much need to wait until an offer is made to somebody. And I know it's difficult to divorce your mind from it, but if you have somebody that comes in that may have, I remember in parks, now this is going to date me, but it was probably back in the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. Yes, I've been here 37 years plus. But now who's below 37? No. But when you make inquiries about applicants, you can't ask questions about their medical fitness nor if they have a disability until a conditional offer of employment's made to individual, and then later on consider it. And I just want to take an aside moment here to make you aware of something. Remember I talked about risk management? Something that I've seen sometimes and had the nip in the bud when I participated in interviews with different departments is there's that temptation that when the candidate's there to avoid asking these questions, and that's what you should do, but when they walk out of the room, somebody says, geez, I wonder how old are they? Are they here to retire or what's going on? Or I noticed that they had and we had a candidate in an interview recently that had some fingers missing. And thank goodness in that group they were well informed and didn't start saying, well, geez, I wonder if they could hold a shovel or whatever. That's important, but that needs to be made a determination after the fact. You can ask a group, as long as you're asking everybody the same question, is there any barrier that you would have to performing this job with or without accommodation? It gets risky because frequently you're going to have somebody then start to tell you about a medical condition, and you may have to tell them, thank you very much, but for right now, we won't address that. We'll just address your other qualifications. And if you're a candidate of choice or one of our top candidates, we may make inquiry into that and then move on. Emergency contact info. I'm not quite certain of the exact genesis of this, but in some cases it might reveal marital relationships, whether they're married or not, and whatever. And those things are getting into protected categories right now. English language skills. Most of that you can pretty much assess if you're talking to somebody. Do they understand what you're talking about? This is mainly about avoiding conflicts that might have to do with national origin or, you know, like asking people, what other languages do you speak other than English? People are protected against discrimination for national origins. Height and weight. Probably the most popular cases came out of, there were a number of state highway patrol agencies that everybody that was going to be a state highway patrol officer had to be 6'3". Well, that had what they call a disparate impact. It impacted a lot of women throughout the United States because there just weren't, at least in those days, so many people that were women that were going to be 6'3". And in some cases, you can have height and weight type considerations, but generally you're talking about people who are pilots that might be fitting into a plane or a small plane or different restrictions where they have to build to a certain level of standards. So they can't have somebody that might be 7 foot tall, you know, with their head up in the canopy and their head cocked to the side, kind of, so to speak, gangster leaning while they're flying a plane. It just doesn't work. Inquiries about marital status are prohibited. You know, do you have children? Are you caring for children? Is that a problem for you with your children? Organizations and affiliations, anything that might reveal somebody's political leaning or religious leanings is prohibited. Protected class, again, this gets back to age. Women that might be going for non-traditional positions. It also might, it could really encompass just about the whole myriad of all the questions that one is prohibited against. Asking questions about religion, you know, do you have to take certain religious holidays and all. Veteran status, generally you're prohibited from asking somebody if they've been dishonorably discharged from the military. If you would be asking somebody, to, you know, tell me about your military experience, such as another job, and they happen to mention, and I'm proud to say I was honorably discharged from the Marines or Army or whatever, there's no problem with that, but asking them were they honorably discharged or not would be prohibited. Citizenship, again, you're getting into national origin, and in some cases that would be discriminatory. And a work schedule that focus on religious holidays. If you ask every candidate, told them this is our schedule, do you have any conflicts with that? As long as you ask all candidates that question and gave candidates the opportunity to explain why they may or may not be able to be present, you could do that. But as a general rule of thumb, if your underlying purpose is to find out they may be off on religious holidays, that gets into a no-no world. So that would be maybe an area of reasonable accommodation that you could grant later. It may be an area that you just can't grant later on. Those are the type of things that you step back if you become aware of that, if somebody becomes a finalist, and maybe contact somebody in HR and say, you know, can you give us any guidance on this? Again, Cindy had said before, and Sarah had said before, that a lot of what we do is we're trying to sell to the candidates that the City of Kettering is a great place to work. We believe in good people, we believe in good character, we believe in high standards, and if you're that type of person, we would most certainly like to join us. You to join us as one of the top candidates and perhaps somebody that might be selected for a position here. Do any of you all have any questions about some of those general areas?
I think one area that we've seen, we've not really had an issue with it here, but you see a lot of cases being litigated, and the concern coming up is people in regards to military, not so much the veteran status or the discharge, although that does come up, but asking about National Guard and Reserve commitments, because with the extended time that we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's not just, you know, 1 weekend a month where they're going to train. You could have a reservist or National Guard person who is deployed, and you know, we have actually had situations where we've promoted employees who, while we're out of country on deployments. But you do have to be careful about that in the interview process. And again, Tom's question about the schedule, you know, that's going to tell you if a person can work the schedule. The candidate can bring it up. But even if they have guard or reserve duty, we have to, you know, make that happen. I mean, that's federal law. We don't have a way around that. And, you know, it really should not play into whether or not this is the best candidate. But I do think people are hesitant about that. I think the other piece on the military is a lot of people are worried about traumatic brain injury, PTSD. You know, I don't want to hire, you know, you hear, you know, see articles and cases about, well, look, you know, we're just worried about that. And that's just an area where we're seeing a lot of litigation, and we're going to see more of that now that we're sort of doing the troop drawdown. We're going to have more and more people trying to acclimate into the civilian workforce. So that's an area where I think is just high on everybody's radar screen, and to just be extra conscientious about it.
Yes, and to supplement what Sarah's saying, and those are extremely important points in these times, is there's a federal law called USERRA, the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Act. I believe I have that covered and correct. It is one of the most powerful civil rights laws that there is in terms of protections of individuals. It just doesn't come up that often, but City of Kettering has historically been extremely committed to making sure that there's no discrimination against reservists or those called to serve in National Guard or other duty abroad. The one last other thing that I'd like to share with you is, as I mentioned before, and just to address briefly, one of the temptations sometimes is you may be in a group while you're conducting interviews. It might be at the first level, and it might be one that you're in charge of. I know that many of you at time to time have done interviews where you're either doing it Lone Ranger style, or you may have another staff person in with you. It is absolutely imperative that you not, once the candidate leaves, start talking about those things that are prohibitive if the candidate was present. Let me tell you what happens. Let's say somebody just reaching for the sky claims, you discriminated against me for based on my age. Well, it might be the least qualified candidate of all the candidates that you have. And way back when, there was what they call a but-for test, meaning that you could talk about their age, or you could talk about their gender or whatever, and would they fit in. And if they couldn't otherwise do the job, you might be on safe ground. But the laws have changed, and if they're even the worst qualified candidate for the job, and in the normal world wouldn't have a prayer of a chance of being hired, if you have those private discussions about how you wonder they might fit in or something like that, and then you're deposed either by the House Civil Rights Commission, an attorney, somebody from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, whatever, you and other people participating in the interview are sworn an oath. So you might keep your mouth shut, but let's say there's 4 or 5 people in there, and one of them says, yes, we did discuss age, but they were the least qualified candidate, or yes, we did discuss that it was a female going into a predominantly male environment, or something like that, you're done. I mean, you're an agent of the city of Kettering when you're acting that way, and that reflects badly on us, and we have to, I mean, it's a very egregious situation. So remember, that which you are prohibited by law, rule, regulation, and policy from considering or discussing with the candidates in their presence, don't be doing it background, and if you have other staff or people assisting you, nip it in the bud and tell them that we're not talking about that. The thing that I would like, and we have had happen before, is if somebody says, did you ever talk about age, or did you ever talk about gender, or did you ever talk about religion? Yes, we did. Prior to our conducting interviews, we went over the requirements for those guidelines to assure that we'd be in full compliance, and we'd focus on job-related questions and considerations. Anything else for right now? Yes.
If we are not asking these questions, but a lot of times we get younger applicants, they're bringing this stuff up on their own, are we still held accountable if they're bringing this stuff up? Can we consider for discrimination that way?
Excellent question. We've had people, let's say, you say, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself for this job? And the person might say, well, I wanted to let you know that I have type 1 diabetes and I have to do, right at that point said, we thank you very much about your candor. The way that this works is if you're offered the position, given a conditional offer of employment, we may have a final discussion for you, or may be sent for a medical evaluation to determine those, you know, to what degree that may or may not be relevant. I appreciate your forthrightness, and I appreciate you wanting to talk about that, but at this time, let's set that in abeyance. That would be the correct answer. If you let them go on and on and on about it, and they tell you a full story, technically, if you didn't ask the question, maybe there's no wrong, but they can always claim that, hey, you knew all of the stuff and you used it against me. And I would say that it's about risk management, trying to avoid those situations that might expose you to undue risk. So that's an excellent question.
And I think one thing that comes up, like if you ask a candidate, we ask this question, but you tell me what your greatest accomplishment is. And they'll say, my kids. And you're like, okay, you know, you're just like, tune that out of your brain. And so a lot of times what we'll do is just steer the conversation. Well, what about, tell me about what what's your greatest accomplishment at work, or what project at work are you most proud of? And then Tom's point, it's always the between the interview conversations, the after interview conversations, where you start to slide down the slippery slope. So here you have a candidate who told you, hey, my greatest accomplishment is my kids. And then the panel has this discussion about, well, I don't know if this candidate is going to work out because she has 2 kids and we need her to work the night shift, right? I mean, this is like your worst case scenario. And it's like, you know, you have to stop that. You know, it's like, yes, the candidate said, my proudest accomplishment is my children, but you have to kind of delete that from your brain. And I think human nature is to make assumptions. I mean, that's how we deal with all the information that we take in all day. But be very, very careful about, even in your own mind, silently making assumptions like, oh, this candidate's got 3 kids, they're not going to work the night shift, or they're not going to like the shift. You don't know. You don't know what people's schedules are, what their desires are. Oh, I'm not sure so-and-so would be interested in promotion because they're very dedicated to their family and they don't want to put in extra time. Don't make those assumptions. 1, it's illegal, and 2, you could be totally operating on false information. But, I mean, part of it is human nature, and you just have to school yourself. That's why we always send these guidelines out to everybody before the interview panels, just as a reminder.
And some people will tell you that going on the kids, you know, the greatest accomplishment with their kids, or they might say, one of my greatest joys and sources of fulfillment and things that I could share with you that would complement my organizational skills would be that I'm the head of the PTA, or that I'm attend such and such a church and I am the secretary or a deacon or something like that, and we have to organize a lot of groups, and that may be related to the job. If they want to share that, that's okay. You don't have to cut them off on that, but you do have to make sure that none of the conversation, either before the candidate or in private, gets into somebody speculating, geez, I don't know about the kids, or I wonder if they celebrate, those holidays that might interfere with our operation. That is prohibitive, and you need to immediately nip that in the bud and focus back on, I generally like to use the rule of thumb, let's focus on who the candidates are that we'd like to hire and why, as opposed to focusing on the candidates that you want to eliminate. Because when you focus on the candidates that you want to eliminate, and you spend a lot of time on that and discussion on that unnecessarily, you generally are stretching the bounds of the risk management, both not only of compliance with the law, but doing the right things for the right reasons.
Anybody have any more questions for Tom in that area? The next thing that we're going to talk about is sort of crafting and drafting your interview questions. And there are lots of different kinds of questions and approaches, so Cindy's going to touch on that for us.
Move ahead on the slides. So there's several types of questions you can ask. If you want specific information from the candidate, such as where did they go to school, where did they receive this certain type of training or this certification, you can ask them, where did you receive this training, and ask them something directly just to get the exact information that you're looking for. And that helps if you're just trying to kind of narrow down some specifics on what you want from the candidate or the information that you want from the candidate. I find that it's better to ask more of an open-ended question. What type of training did you receive? And let them be broad about it. You'll get to understand how they communicate, how they frame up a question, how they articulate information. And they may give you more information than the specific question that you're asking for. So you may find out that they have skill sets that you didn't even know that may not have even been on the resume. So I think it's always better to ask more open-ended questions. You'll get more behavioral traits on the person, and it's just useful to find out additional information. You can ask them also multiple questions, like what experience do you have with personal computers, specifically with spreadsheets, word processing, data software, and maybe what other packages are you familiar with. So you kind of package it all up in one question and then let them go down the path of their training and skill sets in those areas. So you don't have to, do you have training with software? Do you have training with computers? And you can ask it one question and then let them elaborate. Another area that we like to ask are reflective questions. For an example, what's your biggest accomplishment in life? What are you most proud of? It gets them thinking, and it gets you to understand a little bit more about their character, what they're made up of, the things that interest them in life, or the things that are important to them in life. Yes, it may be their kids, and that's a great attribute. You're not focusing on the kids necessarily, but that they have great pride and joy in that, and I think that's a good character. If they said, my greatest accomplishment was stealing the mower out of the back of the van, you're going to be like, well, I don't know if that's necessarily the best candidate for this position.
Only if they were convicted.
Only if they were convicted. So the HR has a host of questions that we can give you that you can choose from, pick and choose from, that fit your particular recruitment. I have a host of questions. And I have a lot of books and resources, but I know within your own department you have just a wealth of information. I think each division, each department has a list of questions, even for each position. I think you've already established some questions. But if you look at it and you want to add to it, if it's a more in-depth type interview, an in-depth recruitment, please feel free to ask us, and I can look at them. I can pull from my sources and give you additional questions to use. Avoid leading questions, because it really isn't helping you to elicit information from the person. So you like to garden? Well, yeah, I like to garden. Or, oh, so you like to swim? Well, that's not helping you much because you're giving them the answer. So you want to try and avoid those type of questions. I always like to open with letting them know that their time is valued. You really appreciate them coming for the interview, either before you start the interview or especially after it's over with. It might have been a long time for all of you before you have been through the interview process. It's only been a year for me, and it is very nerve-wracking if you are the candidate. So the more you can make that person feel at ease when they walk in, you're going to really get a better idea of what their character is. You don't want to get the nervous person, because that's not the true self. That's this kind of false self that's being put out there to show you this is what I can do for an interview. You really want to know what that person's going to be like working day to day. That's the information you're getting. You don't want the scared person, because that's not really the person you're going to work with every day.
And sometimes we'll ask a question like, did you find everything okay? Did you have any problem getting here? And part of it's just to relax the candidate, but you can also elicit some really interesting information like, yeah, I had no problem. I came yesterday. I wanted to see where it was. I actually had a candidate for a pretty high-level position say, yeah, I came in town last night, stayed with some family friends, and I wanted to get acquainted with the town, and I drove your snow route last night. So we're like, okay, well, he had we're kind of breaking the ice, getting the candidate comfortable, and now we've elicited this information that this candidate is on it, he's prepared, he, has done some research, and that speaks well of the candidate and kind of tells you, hey, this person's a go-getter, they're not just showing up for 20 minutes.
A lot of questions we ask are, what do you know about the city of Kettering? And it may seem silly or cliche, but it shows you, did that person take the time to do some research on the city, or on your department, or on your division? Right there will show you how interested they are in this position or just a position. If they're interested in this position, they really would like to work for the city. If they don't know much about the city, well, they probably didn't do much research at all. A lot of times, too, I'll ask questions, and the candidate will get very nervous and clam up, and don't skip the question. Require an answer out of the person. Give them the time to think about it and articulate a very good answer. Sometimes they're nervous and it takes them a while to collect their thoughts, or they may be an introvert type person in their thought process. They need time to collect it and give a good answer. They may not be able to fly off the cuff. So give them the opportunity and the time to answer the question. You may not get the important information that you're looking for if you cut them off and you move on too quickly. And also, don't allow the candidate to sidestep the question. It may be something they're trying to avoid. So take the time, listen. Quiet is your friend. Let that quiet and that space give them time to think and get the right answer from them.
Can I just ask you a question about
Sure.
that? We interview a lot of 15, 16-year-old kids.
Mhm.
They sit across, and if you're asking questions, sometimes they freeze up, and you can actually see them turning red and breaking out in hives, and they're starting to sweat. At what point, we try to rephrase it, and they can tend to get very frustrated. And this is usually their first interview. So do you have any tips or tools for us that we can divert them to get an answer?
Sometimes I'll go back to their comfort zone. So usually if you say, well, walk me through the things that you've done, or walk me through your resume, that gives them, okay, I'm back in my comfort zone, I'm talking about myself, I'm not on the spot, I'm just walking through things that are normal to me. So maybe go back to something that they're comfortable, and you can slide back into that question if it's an important question you need the information from. Just with any conversation, if you're having with a person, you're talking to someone and you see they get flustered or nervous, go back to their comfort zone, and they'll eventually get there.
And sometimes you can just say, look, I know this is really nervous. This might be your first interview. It's okay. They were asking everybody the same questions. Just take a minute. Sometimes if you kind of acknowledge their nervousness too, especially I think with the younger kids, it's hard. It's very hard. And you're dealing with a different level of maturity as well. And different types of questions. I mean, and we've kind of geared this to questions across, whether you're hiring, a concession attendant or you're hiring a director. But the same, I think, basic skills and tools apply. It's just whatever you think in that situation is going to make the person comfortable.
Sometimes I'll tell them a story of, gosh, I went through that too, and not too long ago, and tell them a funny story about yourself, or make them laugh. The more just you can make them feel at ease, the better they're going to feel about the whole experience.
We try that, really. Sometimes it's not quite get where you want it.
I know. So again, if you need interview questions, please feel free to email me, call me. I can send them out to you. Okay. Any questions about that section of it?
Okay, we're good. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is hypothetical and enhanced practicums. And this actually works, I think, regardless of what the position is you're hiring for. And it also depends on how much time you have. And it can be simple, it can be complicated. But, you know, people can look really good on paper. They can say the greatest things. They can tell you they know their way inside and out of Excel. And then Tom will ask them, well, tell me about a spreadsheet or a system that you built from scratch. And they're like, well, I've never done that. You know, we have this Excel spreadsheet set up in our department and I just input data. So one of the things that I like to do are hypothetical situations or enhanced practicums. And they do take a little more time, energy, and effort, but I think you really will differentiate your candidates. And you don't have to do like a big, complicated practicum. You could give a hypothetical situation. For instance, when we were recruiting for the assistant law director in our second round of interviews, we gave the candidates each the same scenario. The law director is out of town. He's actually, what was he? In Nepal, climbing Mount Everest. He does not have a cell phone. His Sherpa does not have a cell phone. He is unreachable. And then there was this crisis. It was a legal issue. There was counsel involved, political issues involved. And we're like, how would you handle the situation? You have 3 hours before the city council meeting starts. What would you do? Some of our best candidates that we'd had so far on paper in the initial interview said, well, I would try and call the law director. We're like, okay, you know, so we're like, all right, remember that wasn't an option. And the other piece of the facts was this particular issue. It was a conflict of interest, and there was an item on the agenda for vote tonight at the meeting. And several of them said, well, we just, if I can be absolutely sure what we should do, we'd cancel the vote. Well, the vote was a very critical economic development project. Okay, so that really wasn't the best option. And so this one hypothetical question, we started to see how people would work their way through a problem in a time crunch when the pressure was high. Because that's a position, I mean, they're on camera live at the city council meeting being asked for legal advice. You have to be able to think on your feet and make a good decision. You guys could do that, like in the recreation side. I mean, a water park manager, okay, you know, you're on shift and 3 lifeguards call off sick, what do you do? You can have all those questions as far as like, so you can see the critical thinking, and you can see, hey, they're not only good on paper, but they have real world skills. The other thing, we did that hypothetical situation in second round interviews for the assistant law director position, and in the third round we were truly evil. We gave them 2 practicums. Actually 3. We requested writing samples, so that gave the candidate an opportunity to give us their best writing sample that they had, no time pressure, something they'd worked on in their career. We also gave them a contract, gave them about 15 minutes to review it and mark it up and tell us what was wrong with the contract and what should be changed. And then we gave them an ethics issue where they had to basically craft a legal opinion. And they had, about 20 to 30 minutes to do both those things. And then they had to come in and present to the interview panel and basically give us legal advice. And actually one of our top candidates crashed and burned in the practicum. Could not handle the time pressure, couldn't handle, no, it has to be this way, it has to be perfect, it has to be just so. Well, sometimes it can't be that way. You have to do the best you can in that 30 minutes. And so it really told us who, you know, could handle it. And actually, Sean Emerson, who we ended up hiring, he thought the practicum was fun. He came in and he's like, wow, that was great. That was awesome. I really enjoyed it. And he really kind of thrived on the pressure. But had we not done that, we might not have parsed out those particular skills. And I always say, you know, you can do an untimed one and a timed one. My preference is usually to look at the timed exercise because you really get to see how a person deals with the stress and the pressure. And that's something we can always help you guys put together. I mean, With the law department, we kind of talked about, do you want to do a hypothetical? We kind of worked together, created the factual scenario, created, what the contracts are going to look like. Clerical positions, you can do the in basket, out basket, where they've got a stack of stuff. What do they have to sort through? How do they prioritize? If you're concerned about people's computer skills, you can always do a computer practicum, just to kind of see. I know like RecTrack is a big system that you use, and you want to make sure people either know it or have the skill set. And that's the other thing, when you're talking to people in these practicums, maybe a candidate didn't understand every nuance of contract law, didn't know the substance of it, but had the ability to troubleshoot, issue spot, and had the skills where, on-the-job knowledge would come later. Because sometimes we're like, the person has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. Maybe they don't know how to do every single aspect of it, but we're seeing the skill set that says, yeah, they're going to be able to do it. So that's just something to think about. It's not, sometimes you guys are in a rush or trying to hire a lot of people at one time. It may not work, for Angie in concessions, but it might work for Diane for a water park manager or something like that. So you just have to kind of look at what position and what your time is and how much you're willing to invest in the process.
I know for Kelsey's position, sorry to pick on you, but when we hired Kelsey, we asked her to come up with some creative projects for the next activities guide, and she was to present it in a formal way at her next interview, and she nailed it. She did a great job. So, and it also, by doing that, we got to see what her skill sets were. But Stacy also came up with creative ideas from the candidates. So she got to pick their brains a little bit on ideas that might be good for activities and programming. So you can use it to solve current problems that you have and get different ideas. It doesn't have to necessarily be a problem that you've had in the past.
Awesome. We're going to switch back to Tom now. Tom's going to talk about sort of wrapping up and closing the interview, and then some just practical questions that we get from folks a lot when we're doing interviews and working through the process.
Sometimes it sounds maybe cold to talk about it this way, but when we're hiring a candidate, they're like a commodity. We're trying to go through a selection process, make a decision as to who's going to fit best into our organization. So sometimes what that means is ultimately you have to bring closure to the process of the different phases of evaluating people. For example, we have many times, almost always, what I'd call a set of first interviews, and if you have a pretty good sized pool of candidates, it's almost without exception that you have second interviews. On occasion, we'll have third interviews, rarely at top level positions. Okay, fourth interviews. And, well, yeah, Cindy, but we actually had to take you to lunch 2 times, was it, to get, yeah. Did she salt her food before she tasted it?
They didn't realize I was playing them. I wanted the lunch.
Yeah, I think after that I was, Tom, you SOB. Why did you ask me those questions? But no, we're glad Cindy's here. And so when you have candidates and you want to ultimately get to closing the interview. Sometimes you want to reverse think. If you were in their shoes, what would you want to know? Well, some of the things you might want to know is what's next. You've just talked to me, but I know there's 20 other people or 30 other people that you're talking to. You may want to know a timeline. And that's a killer, and Mike, that I probably interviewed with more than the rest of you, sometimes we'll have just stuff happen, and it might be park stuff, and it might be HR stuff, or it might even be weather that comes up where his staff has to be dedicated to other things that might be on the interview panel. So sometimes I know that timelines get put off, and it's a very, very difficult situation because the candidates are out there getting antsy and they want to know answers. But that would be another thing that people might want to know about. What's the next step? Do you have any guesstimates as to timelines? And they may want to know, do they have a sense of standing as where they are? Well, what we don't want to do is we don't want to make a commitment that you don't want to create false, oh, you're really good and you're wonderful and all that. You don't want to bait them to make them have high expectations. There's a couple reasons you don't want to do that. If they aren't the selected candidate, sometimes the discrepancy that they feel between how close they are to the apple and how wrong they feel when they didn't get the apple sometimes will come out with that whole myriad of list of things that I was mentioning that are protected that we shouldn't do, and they might just make up one that, you know, you didn't hire me because, and they make up one, and now you're off and running with them. So to the best degree you can, you want to keep them informed as to next steps, as to timelines, but at the same time you don't want to overcommit that they're the final candidate. I think Cindy mentioned this. We definitely want to be show them appreciation for the time they've taken and invested in the application and the interview process. It certainly does. If some of you are relatively recent hires, or you've been promoted in the not too distant past, and you know how important it is to feel valued because you're just spending a lot of time, just like you're cramming for an exam in school, trying to get things done. Do any of you have any questions on that part of it?
I think one of the things I was going to add, Tom, is I think typically depending on the position, we typically don't give the benefits highlights at the first round of interviews. And that's one of the reasons we don't do it. You might be interviewing 20 people. You don't want to send the wrong message, like, hey, you know, you're in the running. They thought I was doing great. They gave me the benefits highlights. So even something that subtle can really put false hope in the eyes of the candidate. And what we're finding with the economy being the way it is, people are very desperately seeking jobs, very highly qualified people because of circumstances they're out of work. And people don't take not getting interviewed, not getting hired as well as they used to be. We've definitely seen an uptick about the number of calls and inquiries we're getting about why wasn't I interviewed. You know, we've had people send their resumes to the mayor's office and say, I don't understand why HR didn't interview me. So definitely be very cognizant of even the subtle hint can sort of, you know, set unrealistic expectations in the candidate.
And that's where Jenny comes in. If somebody comes in,
Jenny.
She earns her money at that time.
Right, that's right.
A lot of times a candidate will ask me, call me later and say, well, why wasn't I hired? Why wasn't I the candidate of choice?
We get that a lot.
And I think at our level, we can probably walk them through some things and give them some ideas to improve their skill sets. But probably at this level, you're better off just to say, you know, we had other candidates that were better qualified, and just leave it at that. And that way, you don't get yourself into any trouble. But I know that you probably do have candidates who will call you and ask you those questions. And you can always refer them to HR if you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Tom, do you want to cover the next item? Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Do you have to ask everybody the same question? I would say to a certain degree it depends. The simple answer is generally no. The reason is if you ask everybody the same questions, you generally are not going to learn about the candidates. There are certain questions that touch on what may be potentially protected class stuff. For example, if you have candidates, if a position requires, let's say, that somebody be able to operate a vehicle, you can go ahead and should ask all those candidates, you know, do you have a valid driver's license or whatever. If you are asking about, if a schedule is very important, you have, Mike and I have been working on a recruitment where it's a split schedule during the day, and it includes weekends and all that, and people really have to be available. But as long as you're asking everybody, is there, you know, is this schedule compatible with your availability? Does this position remain of interest to you? That's a good question to ask every single person and let them tell their own story about it. Because people may say, well, I can't do this because of I got to pick up people at school. If they're telling you that, that's okay, but if that type of stuff comes up, well, you knew I had kids and that's why you didn't hire me, as long as you're asking everybody the same question of that nature. But do you have to have a list that has exactly the same questions on it? There's some people, I know, they will tell you that they think, oh, that's a good idea, and that's because their first goal is risk elimination. They're trying to eliminate all risk, but you're not going to learn about the candidates as well. If you have a set of questions that you'd like to ask, that's good, but be prepared to branch or drill down and ask more in-depth inquiries about their answers. So you can have some standard questions, but must you have exactly the same ones? Did I see some questions?
Well, I think I know the answer. We make a lot of notes when we do our interviews here, which is a little different than the last place I worked at, the notes we took. Do we need to also be careful, things that we're not considering, make sure that they don't end up on the note sheets written down?
Yes. If you make a note, remember the thing about those things that you wouldn't, shouldn't, or couldn't ask a candidate by any law, established policy that you have where violating your own policy, somebody in the school of what people think is the right or wrong thing to do, or fairness, we could use it that way. Let's say a jury, if it ever got to that level, we hope not. But people might say, well, that's not fair. You had a rule that said you wouldn't do this, and you did it. You violated it internally. You must be bad. But anyhow, writing anything down that's a product of an interview process, in most cases is going to become a public record, and on request is discoverable, and is an indication of, or could be distorted of, maybe it wasn't your intent, but could be distorted as an intent to discriminate. So the best answer is be thoughtful about what you write down. And again, this is more of a personal philosophy, but I usually encourage those that I'm interviewing with that are supervisors or managers or directors or whatever to focus more on what about a candidate makes them the best candidate as opposed to what makes them less so. And the reason is if you always keep in mind who your top candidates are, you're making fewer notes, considerations, whatever, so that might get into areas that are either illegal or prohibited or violates rules, regulations, laws. That would be the best answer that I could give you to that.
Right, and some people like to write a description of the candidate so they remember, which is a really bad idea. Like, I've seen a resume, not here, where I worked before. It was actually my resume where I applied for a job, and when they hired me, they gave me my packet, and someone had written on my resume, cute, perky blonde, really young. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, now that I'm this organization's lawyer, we need to have a conversation. I don't know. And I was like, alrighty then. And there was actually, I found out later, discussion about, well, maybe this candidate is, and it was me and another female candidate, we were the finalists, and there was discussion about, well, we don't know if we want to hire somebody that's really attractive. We might have problems with the male employees. And so I'm always like, be very, very careful what you write. And I'm a note taker, but it can come back to haunt you. And I try to do what Tom says. Like, if I'm looking at a candidate and I'm really liking the candidate, I'll just make bullet points. Like, if they talk about a specific project that really catches my eye, then I'll make a bullet, and that'll be something like, Cindy had a lot of experience in the trucking industry, and she was talking about compliance with the drivers. That was something that stuck out to me. We have a lot of compliance issues. We have a whole, 2 whole work groups of CDL license holders. So I made that, comment. And I think it's if you can really stick with the substantive pieces. My preference is don't write on the resume. You can keep your notes separate. It could even be candidate 1, but you're not writing on that resume. And everybody has a different style. There are some people who are like, I'm not writing anything, I'm not going to have a problem, I'm not going to do it. So it's just something to think about. We've had requests before, like, I want to see the interview panel's notes. We had a couple of those recently, and they are most likely a public record. You can always say, well, those are your personal notes to refresh your own recollection. But if somebody really pushed it, we'd have to let them go.
And Sarah just said something there that is, I think, important to think about a little bit when you're talking about writing notes. It could have been that the author of those notes that was saying cute, perky, whatever, was writing what they felt were reasons that this person, they may have thought in innocence that they would have an attractive, high energy, friendly customer service kind of appeal to whatever group. But if that candidate isn't hired, they may take that as an indication that because of those reasons, and this might be a male-dominated area, they were making those notes because they wanted to avoid hiring, in this case, a her into that environment. So it's a time to be thinking about the risk management of it, and that is the value of being informed of where the traps are, if you are, is a way to focus on business-based decisions and writing things in a more neutral fashion that would reflect, if you were right before the candidate, talking before them, or before an audience about that candidate, we're held accountable for it, that it would make sense. The other thing is I know right away this is not the candidate for me. Must I continue the entire interview? I think to a certain degree, and this happens with a good deal of frequency, I think above all and first of all, you want to be courteous to a candidate. You don't want to be dismissive. Many times they're sitting out in the hall and the candidate before them went in for, an hour and 15 minutes and the interview was only for an hour and you have them in there at 5. There's a certain point where you can move it along a little bit. You don't have to cover everything. If you had some canned questions that you were asking and your intent was to ask it to all the candidates, I would encourage you to go through those. But in terms of expounding on it, going into more depth, perhaps not. I mean, this is an exaggerated example, but to a certain degree, you don't need to lift the lid on a trash can to know that it stinks inside. So if you have a candidate that you know is really a bad candidate, you can be looking around in there, you can be digging through the trash, but no matter what, they may not be suitable. And that's a silly example that's exaggerated, but it's to make a point. So if you have a set of canned questions, I would go through those. But where you could trim the interview, if you would, is instead of asking a whole bunch of in-depth questions. If you get somebody, they say they've been fired from 5 jobs and all their supervisors have been, and they use some sort of expletive, you're well on your way of knowing that this is probably not the candidate for you. On the other hand, sometimes when I do that, and again, I've been with Mike the most in interviews, I'll try to catch a look at his eye, and if Mary Beth's in the interview, which is frequently the case, I'll try to catch her eye as to if we're on the same page. And I'll say, well, do you all have any more questions of the candidate? And if they say no, I know we're well on our way to saying thank you very much for coming, whatever. But you do want to be polite, you want to be courteous, and you don't want to push a button where they may be antagonized and come after you just for not treating them civilly.
And sometimes I can be impatient, and when you're doing a lot of interviews, it's like, great, this person looked great on paper, and this interview is a train wreck. But then I always kind of find myself, I'm like, okay, but we're representing the city. We want the candidate to have a good feeling about the city of Kettering, and I kind of frame it up as like, this is a conversation. I'm going to be with this person for 20 minutes. Let's make the best of it, and let's move through the process. And so it just you just have to kind of mentally check yourself and just kind of dig in and. Yeah. I mean, we've had many of those type of interviews.
How about them bagels, or how about them brownies?
That's right. What do you like to do in your free time?
Yeah.
I try and look at the time too, because some people are talkers and some people are very shy and quiet. So if I know it's not a candidate that I'm interested in and only 10 minutes has passed, they're going to know that I'm probably being a little bit rude if I cut them off right then. So I'll extend it and just ask the questions and fill up at least half the time of the interview, so they feel that they've been given the opportunity to sell themselves. So I kind of weigh the time frame as well.
What do I do if a candidate tells me something that's inappropriate or personal?
That never happened.
Yeah.
That never happened.
We won't consider that for employment.
Yeah. Normally in a case like that if they tell you something inappropriate, it depends on your audience, how you want to put it. There's no sense in trying to defuse a bomb once it's gone off. So if they made some sort of quick, inappropriate comment and have moved on, you can either go back and correct them on that or whatever, and it might be a personal story or a little bit of a suggestive innuendo or something that would have been inappropriate. I think in some cases, if it's brief, it's passing, and it's not going to cause major offense, maybe you let them move on. If it's inappropriate to a level where, I don't know, if somebody said, let's say, I'll just go back to parks, if they, for example, said, boy, I've always worked well with all the men that I've worked with and all that and so on and so forth, and I might sometimes add a comment in and say, well, in this position, if you're going to be a supervisor in our parks department or a crew leader, we many times will be working with women as well. And I'll say, put them on the spot and say, have you had experience in working with female candidates or something like that? If you get the feeling that somebody is just, I don't know, some reject from the past that is insensitive to that and might bring problems to the organization, it might be a way to take an opportunity to explore that.
I want to chime in too. I get more of the case, the person's very nervous and they're just on edge, and when I might ask them a question of, I see some gaps in your employment, and they start to cry and they tell me how this person passed away or they got this divorce or something that was just a trauma in their lives. I'll tend to let them just cry it out a little bit and not just cut them off, and treat them as I would if I was having a tearful moment and I was crying, and give them that opportunity, show them the empathy, and then tell them express. I know that must have been very difficult for you to express that to us. I'm sorry that happened to you. Let's move on to something else and move on. So you do cut it off. You don't let it extend on, but you show them empathy that must have been a painful situation for them. I run into that more than anything else.
And Tom has used that approach too. We had a candidate that we were interviewing, and Tom asked the question, have you ever been let go from a position? And the candidate, was very upset, went through the whole process of being fired, and it was very emotional for that particular candidate. And then we're like, and just what Cindy said, it was a very difficult situation, and we're sorry that happened to you. And then we just kind of segue into the next question. But it can be one of those awkward interview moments, and I'm sure you guys have had some of those. Probably with some of the younger candidates, you might get some oversharing as far as their social lives and personal lives and what they do off hours. So, I think part of it's that gut reaction and how do you deal with it at the time. I think you have to kind of trust your instincts and the situation.
If somebody gets into one of those protected areas, in particularly if the protected area has to do with medical, if they start to say, oh, I've been struggling with, and going on and say, I appreciate your candor. I'd like to share something with you that in the employment process or the application process, as employers, we're prohibited from considering any factor having to do with one's medical fitness, if you will, or mental fitness for duty until after a time would be, if it ever came to be, a conditional offer of employment. And at that time we would maybe send a candidate to a doctor if that's appropriate, or ask further questions, are you able to do this job with or without accommodation, and then tell us what those considerations might be. I'm not sure I won't go into a particular example, but if they do, that would be a time to stop them and say thank you very much. If I'm in an interview with staff and somebody leaves the room afterwards, if they've told us stuff that they probably shouldn't have, I try to reshape it into what we can appropriately consider and what we have to put in forbearance until later to consider it another time. How long should an interview last
If sort of medical issues come up when we're hiring people, like let's say lifeguards, for example, is there anywhere along the process where we can, I don't know, send someone for a doctor's approval to work, or like say they're epileptic, which wouldn't be a decision making on hiring, but could put someone in a dangerous situation as a lifeguard? Is there somewhere in that process that we can examine those sort of things?
In your situation is a little problematic, Diane, because you're hiring the temporary, part-time, seasonal, so they typically don't go through the medical review process. So we don't have like the traditional, we make an offer, we send them for all the post-employment testing. But what you could do, if the candidate discloses that during the process, obviously, as Tom said, you can't take it into consideration when making the offer. Because you don't do the post or the pre-employment physical. The assumption is the employee can do the job until, proven otherwise. If some fact or incident or the employee comes to you and says, hey, my medical condition is, I'm having this issue, maybe it's, you've got a diabetic lifeguard, I'm having trouble managing my insulin, we can send them for a fitness for duty exam. We always have that. We can do that for any employee. So, if we find that, let's say you have a lifeguard that has a seizure while working, we definitely you can call us and we can say, we need to see if this employee is able to do the job. And we can send them to our occupational docs and they'll look at them and say yes, no.
If we have prior knowledge, does that put us in a liability situation where something happened, we knew this was a condition, but we didn't look into it?
Yeah, I think that's something that you would want to just, before maybe the person started to work, because you would have to make an offer before you could do anything. So let's say you have that employee and you make an offer, but you're still concerned. I think you call one of the three of us and we walk it through and we could do a pre-employment physical. The downside to that is, well, you gave Cindy a pre-employment physical because she told you she was an epileptic during the process. I could have a medical condition that I didn't reveal and we didn't do it. So we do have to kind of walk through that. So typically your safest assumption is until you have factual evidence that the employee can't do the job, you assume the employee can, and we try to manage the liability as best we can. Like Tom said, there's risk limitation. We can't eliminate it totally, but we can always walk you through that and see if it's a fitness for duty issue.
I would say A+. Consider it another time. How long should an interview last?
Which has been an adjustment point Cindy and Sarah and I are kind of newly working together.
If sort of medical issues come up,
she's the new sheriff in town, so
Yes.
those subtle nuances or very individualized questions many times it's helpful. I was 99 and 9/10% certain of where her thoughts were, but that's helpful to hear. Yeah, we learned it right here.
So how long should an interview last? Basically, to a certain degree, to the best of your ability, no longer than what you've scheduled it. But more importantly, up to the point that it's meaningful. And I think you've heard us all, especially Cindy, emphasize, and I have the similar considerations, is you want to give the opportunity to say, the candidates to say, if you will, their side of the story, and if you have canned questions that you've asked everybody, just in case later on they say, well, the reason that you didn't hire me is because, I don't know, I have purple hair or something like that. What's going to happen is somebody might compare what did you ask other candidates versus this one. And so if you were going by canned set of questions, I saw they had a list of questions and they ask everybody, well, why didn't you ask that person these questions? And they might proffer the idea, the reason you didn't is because they had purple hair and you discriminated against them for purple hair, or who knows what. But Basically, the length of an interview is determined by the period of time it's important to get meaningful information from the candidate, and at the same time balance that out with courtesy and from your time management perspective. And I know some of you are really into that. I know you are. You want to keep them on target, so you're showing the courtesy to other candidates and not creating the perception, especially if they're sitting out there, geez, that really ran over. Now, I have to tell you, though, sometimes when we get to higher level professional positions, I think people generally understand sometimes there might be more that needs to be known about a candidate than another one, and they know they will get the same courtesy to have a little extra time, and we usually come out and say, so sorry, you know, and it works out. But as a general rule, you know, the time is meaningful.
Tom, can I go back? One of the things Tom was talking about, if you have set questions, I like to have set questions because to me it helps me kind of think in advance what I want to ask. But I don't get locked into I have to ask every question. But sometimes when you have those set questions, a good idea is to go through and circle the ones. And I do this when I interview with the city manager and we're interviewing for director level positions. We'll go through our set of proposed questions and we'll circle the ones that we absolutely know we want to ask, and we'll circle the one, and we're going to ask those. Maybe we have 14 questions and we'll circle 5. Those are 5 questions we're going to ask every single candidate. So that kind of is a way to balance being fair, not opening yourself up to any of the discrimination issues, but also giving the flexibility to sort of drill down on a particular area of interest that a candidate has. Now, one thing I would say on the practicums, if you do a practicum, you should give everybody the same practicum. And for a variety of reasons. One, it's the right, fair thing to do. 2, you don't want to have to create multiple practicums. Come up and with one is enough work. But that'll help balance the playing field. But I would give everybody the same, real life exercise.
Okay. Some candidates talk in paragraphs instead of sentences. How can I gain control of the interview process? This comes up pretty frequently. I think there's a point where you can make a polite interruption and say, somebody's going on and on and on, and it says, wow, you could say, wow, that sounds like quite a life experience. If I might, could you specifically answer this question? And you could redirect them the way that you want. I think there's a polite way to interrupt people. It takes a little bit of finesse and assertiveness, but you do want to keep them on track, and you do want to make sure that you compel them to give you the answers that you need to make an effective decision.
A lot of times if it's that long-winded candidate, usually that's not the candidate of my choice. So sometimes I'll just let them go because it's the polite thing to do, knowing it's filling some time. And I may not ask them all the questions and just kind of round it up towards the end. So if they're stealing the whole 20 minutes just in one paragraph, that might be, I'll cut it short from there. That's another way to do it.
Cindy kind of covered this before. What do I do if applicant won't talk to me? Using the open-ended kind of tell me, what was it like to work at such and such a place? What were the nature of your duties that you did daily, as opposed to did you do this, did you do that, did you do this? I think, again, Cindy alluded to this. If you go to an area that might be of their common interest, like sometimes I'll see somebody's hobby, and let's say I'll be in an interview with Mike and his staff, and they might be hitting somebody hard with all the, what makes a tree grow, what makes a tree die, tell me about roots, and they start talking about the book, and they say, no, I didn't mean that, I meant what makes a tree grow. And then what I'll do is I'll say, hey, I noticed that you're a member of a volunteer at the Wegerson Garden Center. What are the kind of things you do there? And generally that's going to be something that they love and they want to talk about. There's an old adage, there's no sweeter music to a person's ears than their own name and stuff about their life. So sometimes when you give a person an opportunity to talk about those things that are of interest to them, it'll lighten up. And I've had some people that will look at me at first quite puzzled in the first time interviews. How come I'll go from very serious, hard-hitting questions and then bounce back to something about sports or something about art or something about a hobby or whatever. And it's usually a diversion to get them from focusing on how nervous they are about stuff.
Because you know us, we like to have a little fun, we like to be interactive. We gave you guys 3 resumes. You have a Bart Simpson, Maggie Simpson, and Claire Dunphy. What we would like to do is break you into, I think with our numbers, we'll probably do 2 groups of 3. So you'll have 2 people be the interview panel, and one of the group be one, and we'll just, you guys can, maybe one group can do Bart, one group can do Maggie, and we'll leave Claire for another day. But one of you play the role of the interviewee. And what we're going to do is Tom and Cindy and I are going to go around and talk to the interviewee a bit before you start your mock interview. So you're going to do a mock interview of the candidate for about 10 minutes or so. And then once you've done your mock interview, what we'll do is we'll kind of break out and kind of debrief what your interview was like, what happened. Was your interviewee troublesome? Did they give you a hard time? Were you able to keep the interview on course and on point? So if you guys want to kind of just decide how you want to.
Did you have a thought as to what the position might be?
Yes, it is a front desk. It's like a front office supervisor person.
Supervisor.
So they're like sort of customer service, but they're also supervising other customer service. So like customer service coordinator would be good. Yeah, that's good. Coordinator. There you go, Angie. Coordinator. So Diane's group, talk to us a little bit about what the issues were in your interview group. So you guys were Bart Simpson, right?
Right.
So how did the interview go with Bart?
Actually, Bart knew quite a bit just from glancing at the resume. Bart made it up quite well. And the only issue was a very generic question was asked about availability. And it came up that since Bart is in the reserves, that he would be gone for 2 weekends a month, and then asked if that was a problem. And we said absolutely not, that we would work around it.
Okay. Anything else come up interesting during the interview? No?
I don't think so. No. Other than Bart uses gum as incentives for staff out in the desert.
All right.
Gum to clarify. Gum.
Motivation.
She knew how to become Bart far better than we thought, and we had concerns about she may be pathological.
That's what she really got into the role.
She did.
All right. So then we had this other group, right? And you guys were Maggie Simpson, right? And Kelsey played the role of Maggie. So what kind of issues did you guys run into your interview?
Well, I went into the union versus non-union. Brought up religion. I brought up hobbies that probably didn't matter that much. Just making them very uneasy, and they're just wanting to continue with the interview. So.
All right. So when Maggie brought up these areas that were of concern to you guys, how'd you deal with it? I'll go this way.
Well, we didn't focus on on some of her union interest or the religious interest, and we really tried to get back to discussing what skills do you have, and tell us a little bit about those. And it seemed to be we kept having a hard time. We had to keep coming back to I understand you want to start a union, but what are your skill sets? So.
Okay. And did you guys? It really wasn't on our list of things that we talked about earlier about union activity and unionization. So what made you think it was an off-limits area?
Well, the fact that it seemed to be taking us away from what are your skills, what are your skills to do this job? I got it. It kind of kept getting into her personal interest or personal likes, and we kept trying to bring it back to, okay, what are your skills for this job?
Okay. So that was great. Well, that's an interesting point because we did the union one on purpose because it really wasn't on our list, but it is an area that you need to avoid. It kind of falls into the free speech, protected political activity. It might not necessarily come up that much on the recreation side, but again, on Mike's side, on the park side, there are union employees. And it doesn't always come up with new hires, but it can. We recently interviewed an employee in the public service department who was the union president at his previous employer. So, but you can't really take that into consideration. Here you might have somebody that's up for promotion. Well, I don't know, Joe was a problem when he was in the union. How's he going to be with the supervisor? He's going to be very sympathetic. You cannot engage in that type of analysis or conversation. And actually what you'll find is a lot of union leaders, really good ones, actually are union leaders because not so much that they're pro-union necessarily, but because they have really good leadership skills. And they can actually work up the chain of command. In fact, I worked for a jurisdiction who the city manager was the FOP president, and then ultimately worked his way up through command in police, became the police chief, and then later became the city manager. So again, it kind of goes back to there's the legal issue, and then what I talked about earlier is don't make assumptions about people sort of where they're coming from and what they're capable of. But I popped in, and I know Cindy and Tom observed, and I think you guys all did a really good job about keeping the interview on point, on task, and redirecting everyone back to what was relevant. So that is pretty much everything that we wanted to talk about today. Cindy has some just very fun stuff that she got off of Career Builder, some top 10 interesting things that people reported that had occurred in interviews, and we thought you might kind of enjoy hearing them.
One, the candidate answered their cell phone during the interview and then asked the interviewer, "Please leave the office, I need to consider this phone call." One candidate told the interview he wouldn't be able to stay long with the job because he might be getting an inheritance from his uncle, and his uncle didn't look real good. One candidate asked the interviewer for a ride home after the interview. Another one smelled his armpits on the way to the interview room. Probably not a good idea. One candidate said she could not provide a writing sample because all of her writing had been for the CIA and was very classified. One candidate told the interviewer she was fired for beating up her last boss. Ooh. When the applicant was offered food before the interview, he declined, saying that he didn't want to line his stomach with grease before he went out drinking that night. Probably not a good thing to say in an interview. A candidate was looking for an accounting position and said she was a people person but not necessarily a numbers person. For an accountant, probably not a good thing to say. Another candidate flushed the toilet while talking to the interviewer during a phone interview. I wouldn't want to have heard that. And another candidate took out her hairbrush and brushed her hair mid-interview. So probably things you shouldn't do or things you should not look for your interviewees to be doing.
And hopefully you won't have any interviewees like that. Do you guys have any questions before we kind of finish up? Anything else that we can address for you or help you with? Kelsey's going.
They're very specific, though, to mine.
That's okay.
Okay.
Fire away.
Position description. When is a good interview, or when is a good time to give that to them? Like an actual written, or should we not, or should we?
I post it with the recruitment announcement, and I give it to them even before I interview them, so they have a chance to read it and understand what the job actually entails.
Okay.
So then I can even use that as talking points during the interview. You know, what are your skill sets? Can you meet this job description?
So, can I email it potentially?
Mm-hmm. I email it to all when I'm sending an email confirmation that here's your interview time and place, and here's the people you're interviewing with. I always include the position description with that email.
It also kind of addresses the situation where Angie had, where you have a really nervous candidate. If they have the job description, one of the questions you can ask is, hey, we sent you the job description before the interview. When you looked at it, what things in the job description did you think you would really do well at or excel at? Another thing is, what in the job description scared you? What do you think, is sort of your learning curve? What do you think is a weakness as far as your qualifications? So you can actually use it as a question tool.
And then the other one, very specific to us, we set up a group interview, or they always have in the past, and I used it last year. It's really great for our type of position. And do you see any problems with that? We don't typically ask questions that would come up in the individual part of it, but is there anything that you could see, like red flags, the group dynamic?
I think the group interviews work good for you guys because you have to hire such a large volume in a short amount of time. I think the one thing you have to be careful is if you had sort of a rogue interviewee that would try and get, the group interview off on a tangent. But from what I saw from you guys today, you do a really good job of redirecting. So I think your hiring process is so unique. A group interview would work. And I mean, it can work at a higher level. I'll give you an example. When I was being recruited by the city, I had a first interview. It was pretty intense all day, spending here with folks. And then they sent the finalists. We got invited back for the next day. You interviewed all day. You got a call like by 6:30 to say, come back for breakfast tomorrow. And when I looked at the schedule, it was clear that all the candidates were having breakfast together. So the 3 finalists for my position had, don't laugh, Tom, it wasn't funny. The 3 finalists had breakfast together with all of the department directors. And we had to mingle and mix together, knowing that we were competition for each other. And they made us introduce ourselves in front of the whole group as well. So it was very awkward.
And that's why we do.
Right, see how people work in a high-pressure situation. The ironic thing was the 3 of us knew each other through our professional association. We didn't know each other really, really well, but we knew each other, and we kind of moved in the same HR circles. And so the 3 of us, I think we were pretty good-spirited about it, and we joked that we could introduce each other. But it is, it's torture. I mean, as a candidate, it was torture. But I understand the reason for it, to see how people deal with awkward social situations, high-pressure situations. And we deal with a lot of awkward situations in the HR department. So it was a good tool. So I think you guys are right on to use it. I think you just have to make sure you can keep control of the situation and keep it narrowly focused. Yeah. Diane.
Our second step of the process is a water skills test, and we only invite them, the people, it's kind of like their second interview, I would say, that we think are qualified, that we're interested in. Is that okay to say either at the end of the interview, like, please come join us for this, or we're going to notify you by this date? Is that an okay way to close things?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're saying is you do a sort of traditional first interview, and then you have the water skills test as the second interview. So yeah, I think it's fine when you close the interview, you say the next step in our process is, our successful candidates moving forward will be invited back for the water skills test. We'll notify you, one way or another. And I think that's something we do really well here, is we notify candidates one way or another. We talk to candidates all the time that apply for city, jobs in other places, and they don't hear from people. So I think that what you're doing makes a lot of sense.
By them immediately at that interview, say, we'll either get back to you by this date I don't give them an either or. I say one or the other. I say, please join us for the skills test on February 26th at 5 p.m. Are you available then? Is that an okay?
Right. I mean, again, because you guys have such mass recruitments in a short amount of time, if you interview someone and yes, I want this person to move forward, I think given the nature of your situation, it's fine to move people forward right at the spot. Yeah, absolutely.
We have a secret term of paper.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. Anybody else? Okay, well, great. Thanks for joining us today. And we did tape today's session, so if you want to take it back with, your other work, your coworkers, your divisions, your other work groups, it'll be available once we get additional copies made. Awesome. All right.
We'll post it on the barn too. You probably are familiar with the barn. I'll post it, and you can just click on it and watch it.